There is a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I know that now. I learned it the hard way, over years of conversations that went nowhere, apologies that changed nothing, and explanations that were met with the same misunderstanding I had just finished carefully dismantling. It is the tired of a person who has been speaking into a room that was never actually listening. And the moment I finally stopped, the moment I closed my mouth and let the silence be, was the most peaceful moment of my adult life. My name is Nadia. I'm 31 years old. I'm a project manager from Denver, Colorado, and I want to tell you about the 2 years I spent learning that clarity is not the same thing as connection, and that peace, real peace, does not require anyone else's understanding to exist. The early years of explaining. I was raised to believe that communication solved everything. My parents were not bad people. They were earnest, well-meaning, conflict-averse people who had built their marriage on the unspoken agreement that as long as everyone said the right words in the right order, the family would stay intact. We talked about our feelings. We used I statements. We had household meetings where grievances were aired and resolutions were agreed upon and then, quietly, ignored. I grew up thinking that if I could just find the right language, I could reach anybody. I carried this belief into my friendships, my romantic relationships, my workplace, and most of all into my closest relationships, the ones with the people I loved the most and therefore needed most desperately to understand me. My most important relationship was with my older sister, Priya. She was 4 years older, deeply certain about everything, and had a gift for making you feel like the problem in any situation without ever technically saying so. We were different in almost every way that counted. She was structured where I was spontaneous. She valued tradition where I valued autonomy. She expressed love through management, through advice, through critique, through the constant low-frequency signal of someone who believes they know better than you and considers it their duty to broadcast this indefinitely. I loved her. I also spent most of our adult relationship exhausted by her. And for years, for the better part of a decade, I responded to that exhaustion the way I had been raised to respond to everything. I explained myself. I told her how I felt. I sent long messages laying out my perspective with the patience and thoroughness of someone preparing a legal brief. After difficult conversations, I would follow up. I would clarify. I would reopen closed things because I was so certain that if I could just say it slightly differently this time, something would finally click. Nothing ever clicked. The pattern I couldn't see. The hardest part about patterns is that you're inside them while they're happening. You can't see the shape of the thing you're living in because the shape is everywhere around you. It's the furniture, the walls, the air. Looking back now, the pattern is almost embarrassingly obvious. But from inside it, it just felt like trying. Just felt like loving someone the only way I knew how. Here is what the pattern looked like from the outside. Something would happen. Priya would say something that hurt me, or make a decision that affected me without consulting me, or dismiss something I cared about with the casual ease of someone who had never been required to take me seriously. I would feel hurt. I would sit with the hurt for a day or two, composing in my head how to bring it up. Then I would bring it up, carefully, generously, framing it in exactly the way my childhood training had taught me. I would say how I felt, not what she did. I would use calm language. I would come with an open hand, not a fist. Priya would listen. I always gave her that. She was a good listener in the sense that she would let you finish before she began dismantling what you'd said. And then she would explain, with great patience and internal consistency, why my feelings were a misreading of the situation. Why I had taken something the wrong way. Why, if I looked at it from the correct angle, her angle, I would understand that no harm had been intended, and therefore none should be felt. I would try to explain that intent and impact were different things. She would explain that she knew her own intentions better than I did. I would try to explain that I wasn't questioning her intentions, just naming my experience. She would explain that my experience was based on an incorrect interpretation. I would try to explain, and we would go around and around and around. Every conversation a wheel. Every conversation ending in the same place, with me having said everything I meant to say, having said it clearly and fairly and with love, and with nothing changed at all. The specific cruelty of this dynamic, and I want to name it clearly because I think a lot of people are living inside it right now, is that it teaches you the wrong lesson. It teaches you that the problem is your execution. That you almost got through this time, that if you had framed it slightly better, found the slightly more perfect word, calibrated the tone a little more finely, you would have landed. So you keep trying. You keep refining. You become, over years, extraordinarily good at explaining yourself, because you have spent years treating every failed attempt as a data point for the next one. What you don't realize, until much later, is that the conversation was never actually available. The door you kept knocking on was not a door. It was a wall painted to look like one. The conversation that broke something open. About 2 years ago, something happened that I want to be honest about without turning into a story about villainy, because this is not that kind of story. Priya made a significant decision about our family, specifically about our parents, who were beginning to navigate some health issues and needed organized support, without including me in the conversation. She had spoken to other family members, made a plan, assigned roles, and then presented me with my role as though she were handing me a memo from HR. My role, as she had designed it, was the smallest one, the least consequential, the one furthest from any real decision-making. And when I asked, carefully, why she hadn't included me in the planning, she said, and I want to quote this exactly because it is the sentence I have turned over in my hands so many times that I have memorized every surface of it, she said. I just knew you'd make it complicated. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, very calmly, that I would like to be included in decisions that affect me and our parents. She explained why the plan was good. I said the plan might be fine, but the process had excluded me. She explained that the process had been efficient. I said efficiency wasn't the point. She explained what the point was from her perspective, which was different from mine. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes. And I had a thought that I had never quite had before, in all the years of circular conversations and careful reframings and patient re-explanations. The thought was this: she is never going to hear me. Not because she can't, because she has decided not to. And no sentence I construct, no matter how careful or clear or loving, is going to change that decision. Because the decision isn't about my sentences. It's about what I represent in her internal story. And in her internal story, I am the one who makes things complicated. That is a fixed point. I cannot move it. I have been trying to move it for 10 years, and it has not moved an inch. I went upstairs to my apartment. I made dinner. I did not send a follow-up message. I did not compose the email in my head. I did not lie awake running through how I might say it differently next time. I just let it be what it was. Going quiet. The decision to stop explaining was not dramatic. I want to say that clearly because I think there's a version of the story where the narrator hits a wall and makes a grand declaration and changes overnight, and that is not what happened to me. What happened was more like a slow, deliberate withdrawal of effort, like a river that doesn't stop flowing, but changes its course. I stopped sending the follow-up messages. I stopped reopening conversations that had been closed without resolution. When Priya said something that landed wrong, I let it land, and I let it sit there without immediately scheduling the postmortem. When family members misread my choices, and they continued to, they had been doing it for years, and they didn't stop just because I stopped correcting them, I nodded and said something noncommittal, and went home, and did the thing I was going to do anyway. The first thing I noticed was the time. I had spent so much of my mental and emotional bandwidth on the ongoing project of being understood that when I stopped, I had hours back. Literal hours, in a week, that had previously been consumed by the composition and revision and sending and anxious waiting for response cycle that my explanations had required. I didn't know what to do with them at first. I felt almost itchy, like someone had taken a cast off a limb that had been immobilized for so long the muscles had forgotten how to work. I used the time. I read more. I went for runs at odd hours and let my mind do whatever it wanted instead of working through conversational strategy. I called the friends who had always understood me without much effort, and there were some, I want to say that clearly, there were people in my life for whom I had never needed to explain myself because something just translated, and I spent more time with them and less time on the relationships that required constant translation work. The second thing I noticed was how much of my self-image had been tied up in other people's understanding of me. I had believed, I think without ever quite saying it to myself, that I was only as real as I was legible. That if Priya didn't understand me, or my parents didn't quite see me, or my ex-boyfriend had never grasped what I was actually saying, then I was, in some way, incomplete. Unfinished. A sentence without a period. Going quiet forced me to confront this belief directly, and to discover that it was not true. I was just as real whether or not anyone understood me. I had always been. That sounds simple. I promise you it wasn't. What misunderstanding actually costs, and what it doesn't. I want to talk about what I lost when I stopped trying, because I think honesty requires it. I am not going to pretend this was only gain. I lost the hope. That particular, sustaining, slightly delusional hope that the next conversation would be the one that finally worked, that Priya would finally hear me, that my mother would finally stop filtering my choices through her fears, that the people I loved would one day reflect back a version of me that I recognized. When I stopped trying, I had to give up that hope. And grief came with it. Real, unflashy grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but arrives on a Tuesday morning when you're making coffee and you realize that you have quietly mourned a future that was never actually coming. I want to sit in that for a sentence or two, because I don't think people talk about it enough. Giving up on being understood by someone you love is a loss. It is not a triumphant moment. It is a quiet, necessary sadness that you have to move through rather than around. I moved through it, but I moved through it. What I did not lose, what I discovered I never had to risk, was myself. This was the thing that undid me a little when I understood it fully. I had been acting as though being misunderstood was a threat to my identity. As though without external validation of my inner life, the inner life itself was somehow in jeopardy. It was not. My sense of who I was, once I stopped outsourcing it to other people's comprehension, turned out to be remarkably stable. Turns out you don't need anyone to understand you in order to remain yourself. You were always yourself. The understanding was never load-bearing. The twist I didn't see coming. About 8 months into my quiet, something happened that I genuinely didn't predict. Priya called me, not because something was wrong, not with a plan to relay or a correction to offer, just called, and said she wanted to have lunch. Not a family obligation lunch. Just the two of us, a restaurant I chose, a Saturday afternoon with no agenda. We went. It was strange. Without the circling argument that had structured most of our recent conversations, neither of us was quite sure how to navigate the space. We talked about our parents. We talked about a show we had both watched. And then, in a pause between topics, Priya said, and I want to be careful to get this right, she said, "You seem different lately. More settled, I think." I said, "I think I am." She said, "You used to always seem like you were trying to convince me of something." I looked at her. I said, "I was." She nodded slowly, as though filing this away. Then she said, "What changed?" I thought about this for a moment, and I said, "I stopped needing you to agree with me. I just started doing the thing anyway." She didn't respond to that directly, but something shifted at that table. Slightly and genuinely, the way ice shifts in a glass when the temperature changes, just a small quiet sound, and then a new arrangement. We finished lunch and hugged outside the restaurant, and it was not a resolution, but it was real, which was more than I'd had in years. Here is what I think happened. When I stopped fighting for her understanding, I stopped being someone she needed to manage. Without my constant appeals to her judgment, she had nothing to push against. And when people have nothing to push against, they sometimes, not always, not inevitably, but sometimes stop pushing. They get curious instead. They come toward you rather than positioning themselves opposite you. I had been so focused on making her understand me that I hadn't noticed I was keeping us locked in a dynamic that required her to be the expert on my experience. When I took that role away from her, when I quietly, without announcement, became the only authority on my own life, the whole structure changed. The life that opened up and inquired. In the time since I stopped trying to be understood, I have done more with my life than in the 5 years before. I think that's worth saying plainly. I applied for a senior role I'd been circling for 2 years, circling it because I had absorbed, through 100 small moments, the idea that I was too young or too inexperienced, or that wanting it too openly was somehow unseemly. I applied. I got it. I manage a team of 12 now, and I am good at it, and I know I am good at it, and I no longer need a panel of family members to confirm this for me. I moved to a smaller apartment that is entirely my own in every aesthetic and spiritual sense. Not a single piece of furniture chosen with someone else's approval in mind. Not a single decision deferred, because I wasn't sure how it would read. My friend who came to visit for the first time stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "This looks like you." I said, "That was the whole point. I have better friendships now than I've ever had." Part of this is simply paying more attention to the people who actually see me, discovering that they were always there, always had been, just harder to notice through the noise of the people who didn't. My friend Yolanda, who has known me since college, once said something that I think about constantly. She said, "You know, you never used to just say what you wanted. You always gave this whole explanation first, like you were asking permission." I said, "I know." She said, "You don't do that anymore." I said, "I know." And she smiled and said, "It's so much better." My relationship with Priya is the most honest it has ever been. Not warmer exactly, I want to be accurate, but more real. We are two people now who know each other's limitations clearly and have chosen to be in each other's lives anyway, which is a much more durable arrangement than two people pretending those limitations don't exist. She still does the things sometimes, the quiet management, the reframing of my experience into something more convenient for her. And I still feel it when she does. But I no longer take it as an assignment. I let it pass. I go home to my small, fully myself apartment and I make tea and I sit with my own understanding of my own life. And it is enough. It is more than enough. What I know now. I want to tell you the actual lesson, the one underneath all of this, because I spent a long time looking for it and I want to save you some of that time. Being understood is not a need. It feels like one. For years it felt to me like the most fundamental need I had, more urgent in certain moments than food or sleep or money. I needed Priya to hear me. I needed the people I loved to recognize me. I needed the understanding the way you need oxygen, constantly, urgently, in a panic when it felt withheld. But needs, if they go unmet long enough, teach you something. They teach you whether they were actually structural or whether they were habits. Oxygen is structural. You cannot become okay without it. Understanding, I discovered, is a habit. A beautiful one. A deeply human one that makes life richer and relationships real, and the world a much less lonely place when it's present. But not structural. Not oxygen. You do not die without it. You do not even diminish. You just get quieter for a while, and in the quiet you discover that you were whole the entire time. I still want to be understood. I want that for all of us. I hope you have people in your life who see you clearly and love what they see. I hope you have a Yolanda, someone who knew you before you learned to explain yourself and loves you anyway. But I no longer confuse wanting it with requiring it. And I no longer confuse the people who withhold it with people who have power over my sense of myself. The peace I found in going quiet is not the peace of giving up. It is the peace of someone who has stopped fighting a battle that was never going to end and discovered, in setting down their weapons, that the field they were standing on was beautiful all along. I had just been too busy fighting to look up and see it. The last time Priya and I had lunch, she told me she was proud of what I'd built. She said it plainly, without caveat, without the quiet asterisk of qualification that used to accompany every compliment she gave me. And I said thank you. And I meant it cleanly, without the old hunger underneath it, without the desperate intake of breath of someone who has been waiting years to hear this particular sentence. I had stopped needing it. And only when I stopped needing it did it finally arrive. That is the thing about peace. It does not come to those who chase it loudest. It comes to those who finally get still enough for it to find them.